أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الحلقة الخاصة من حوار خاص تأتيكم من جامعة أكسفورد مركز دراسات الشرق الأوسط. هذه الحلقة أسجلها مع الأستاذ الدكتور آفي شليم أستاذ العلاقات الدولية في جامعة أكسفورد، وهي بمناسبة مرور 100 عام على وعد بلفور. والأستاذ الدكتور آفي شليم له كتابات في هذا الموضوع وفي قضايا تتعلق بالتاريخ الحديث لمنطقة الشرق الأوسط. Professor Avi Shleim, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
I want to begin with you with two quotes about the Balfour Declaration. The first quote is from the British Prime Minister who recently spoke about the British role in the Balfour Declaration. Theresa May said about the Balfour Declaration, "It is one of the most important letters in history. It demonstrates Britain's vital role in creating a homeland for the Jewish people. And it is an anniversary we will be making with pride. We will be marking with pride." In other words, she intends to celebrate the anniversary as a great achievement by the British Empire. The other quote is an absolute opposite of that, and it's your own verdict about the Balfour Declaration, where you say, "The Balfour Declaration was not only unfair to the Arabs, but it was detrimental to the interests of the empire," that is the British Empire, "and indeed it was one of the worst blunders in British imperial history." And one wonders, if it was such a blunder and it was so bad for British interests, why someone like Theresa May would want to celebrate it. But before we hear your answer to this question, why in the beginning do you think it was a great blunder in the history of Britain?
I would rather start with Prime Minister Theresa May's verdict about the Balfour Declaration and then turn to my own verdict. The first part of her statement, I agree that the Balfour Declaration was one of the most important documents in history, certainly of the history of the Middle East. It was a very brief document, only 67 words long, yet it had the most far-reaching consequences for the Jews, for the Arabs, and for the entire region. The Balfour Declaration, by supporting a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, laid the foundations for the creation of the state of Israel. It prepared the ground for the Zionist takeover of most of the country. And Zionist land acquisitions and ethnic cleansing continues to this very day. So Britain has a historic responsibility for the loss of Palestine to its Palestinian inhabitants. And therefore, I think that the British government today has nothing to celebrate. It really ought to apologize to the Palestinians for the Balfour Declaration.
Do you think people like Theresa May know the facts of history, or she is just speaking politics without any knowledge of what went on 100 years ago?
It seems to me that Theresa May is both ignorant about the history of the last 100 years, but she's also indifferent to that history. What she's concerned with is the situation today and her government, and she in particular, are one-sided in this conflict. They are uncritical supporters of the State of Israel and everything that goes with the State of Israel, including an apartheid system.
Now, if we go to those years, 100 years ago, what do you think prompted the British to do this?
There isn't one simple explanation about the motives of the British for issuing the Balfour Declaration. It was a mixture of motives, but broadly speaking, there are two schools of thought about why Britain came up with the Balfour Declaration. There is still a debate going on among historians, but the two broad schools of thought are altruism and imperialism. The altruistic school says that the Balfour Declaration was a very noble Christian project to enable an ancient people to return to its ancestral homeland. And in support of this view of British altruism, it is mentioned that some of the British policymakers were brought up on the Bible, that they knew the Old Testament, and that there was an element of biblical romanticism, particularly in the case of David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, who was familiar with the biblical names for the places in present-day Palestine. My own view is that this notion of British generosity, British imperial generosity, and a desire to help the Jews to build up a home for themselves, which is still echoed in Theresa May's verdict, that this notion is baseless. There is no historical evidence to support it.
Actually, there is evidence against it, because David Lloyd George was not much of a Jew lover, was he?
No. And I'd like to come back to that, to the elements of anti-Semitism behind the Balfour Declaration. But let me just outline briefly the second school of thought to which I subscribe, which says that the key to the declaration in British imperialism, that there were calculating considerations of British imperial self-interest that led to the support of the Zionist movement. And tied to that was also a misperception of the power of the Jews. This was particularly pronounced in the case of David Lloyd George, who became Prime Minister in December 1916, and he had a hugely exaggerated idea of the power of the Jews. He used the words very often of the Jews, world Jewry, international Jewry, and he had an image in his mind of the Jews as being uniquely powerful force in world politics, a subterranean force which wasn't obvious on the surface, but extended throughout the world, especially to the Soviet Union after the 1917 Bolshevik revolution, and to the United States. So David Lloyd George believed that, mistakenly, that the Jews were uniquely influential. He thought that they made the wheels of history turn, and therefore if Britain made this gesture towards them, Britain would acquire a major strategic ally in the world war.
Is it likely that he was influenced at the time by conspiracy theory, by the documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that gave the impression of such global Jewish power?
I think it's very unlikely that he was actually influenced by conspiracy theories. Rather, he had early contacts with the Zionist movement. He was a lawyer, and I think it was 1903, the Zionist Federation got in touch with him, and he represented the Zionist movement in London. So he had early contact with Zionists, and through them he learned what were their ambitions and what they were about. So I think it was these early contacts that influenced him, but when he became Prime Minister, it was imperial considerations rather than empathy and understanding of the Jews that motivated him.
What is the role of Christian Zionism in this regard? I mean, we usually read that the political elite in Britain at the time were also influenced by Christian Zionism. Was David Lloyd George one of them?
Yes, Christian Zionism in Britain had a long history, and it went back a long way, and it was reflected in Victorian literature, like the novel Daniel Deronda. So Christians tended to be inspired by the reading of the Bible and to have sympathy for the Jews. And some of them had a literal interpretation or understanding of the scriptures. They thought that Armageddon will happen and the Messiah will come back, and then he will convert all the Jews to Christianity. So there was an element of religious thinking that influenced the British political class, but I don't think it was a dominant consideration in the minds of the top policymakers.
Now, so we have these two theories, and you favor the imperialist explanation of what went on. But yet, at the same time, I read in your paper that there were members of the British cabinet at the time who were opposed to this project.
It is important to remember that the Jews did not speak for the Jewish community, that the Zionists did not speak for the Jewish community in Britain. The Zionists were a tiny minority. It was Dr. Chaim Weizmann, who was a Russian Jew, and a band of fanatics, Zionist fanatics, around him. And Lloyd George made the mistake of thinking that the Zionists spoke for the Jewish community. They did not. The reality was that the Zionists were a tiny minority within the Jewish minority in Great Britain. And the majority of British Jews were opposed to the Balfour Declaration. And the best example of that opposition is Sir Edwin Montagu, the Secretary of State for India, who was the only Jewish member of David Lloyd George's cabinet. And in August 1917, a few months before the declaration was issued, which was on the 2nd of November 1917, Sir Edwin Montagu submitted a 4-page memorandum to the cabinet, and the title of the memorandum was The Anti-Semitism of the Present British Government. The anti-Semitism of the present government.
The government that was promoting...
His government.
Yes.
So he was submitting this paper to his colleagues in the cabinet at a time when issuing the Balfour Declaration was under active discussion, and he made the case against it.
So in other words, Montagu, when he protested against the government of David Lloyd George and the Balfour Declaration, he was actually speaking for the majority of the Jews that lived at the time in Britain.
Montagu emphatically spoke for the great majority of the Jews in Britain, and importantly, he reflected the views of the leaders of the Jewish community. And the main point he made in his memorandum was that the Jews are a religion, not a nation. And therefore, it made no sense at all to bring Jews from different parts of the world into a Jewish state in Palestine, because a Jew from China would have very little in common with a Jew from Austria or a Jew in Argentina. They were completely different. The only thing they had in common was their religion. And he himself, Montague, was first and foremost a British citizen and only secondly a Jew.
So there was a fear here for loss of citizen rights.
Absolutely. In fact, that was his main argument, that a Jewish state in Palestine would undermine the struggle for equal rights for Jews everywhere, in Britain, in Europe, and everywhere else. Because if there was a Jewish state in Palestine, and any Jew who complained about anything, the obvious answer to him is, if you don't like it here, why don't you go to your own country? So Montague, in other words, was saying that a Jewish state would be contrary, that the Zionist project worked against the struggle of the Jews for emancipation and for equal rights. And he said that if Britain supported a Jewish state in Palestine, that would make his position and the position of other Jews in Britain very difficult. People would be able to say, you're an alien, you don't belong here. Mm-hmm. So he had extremely powerful arguments against issuing the Balfour Declaration, but his objections were overridden.
Now, going back to the motives of British politicians at the time, you say it was primarily imperialistic. But from what I read also, there is a sentiment of racism against the Arabs as well. So maybe that at least contributed to the project somehow, because they acted as if the Arabs didn't matter, as if they didn't exist, or as if they didn't deserve to be considered at all.
Behind the Balfour Declaration was a colonial mindset of disdain and disregard for the natives, for the Arabs. In the case of Arthur Balfour, he was actually an anti-Semite. He, by his own account, had a conversation with Cosima Wagner, the wife of the composer, who was anti-Semitic, and she was also anti-Semitic. And by his own account, Balfour said that I told her I shared many of her anti-Semitic views.
He admitted that.
He admitted that. And in 1905, when Balfour was Prime Minister, he introduced the Aliens Bill, which prevented Jews facing persecution in Eastern Europe from coming to this country. So it was the first major piece of anti-immigration legislation in this country. Moreover, in 1919, Balfour made a statement. He wrote it. I wish I could quote it word for word, but I can't. But the thrust of what he said was, Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is of far greater import than the desires and the prejudices of the natives of this country.
Meaning the Palestinians.
Meaning the Palestinians. So that revealed his racism, because the Jews had traditions, had a past, had a future, they mattered, whereas the Palestinians had no rights. They only had desires and prejudices which were of no interest to him. So this quote is the best example that I've come across of double standards, of disdain and indifference towards the Arabs, and thinking that the Jews were much more important. But there is another quote from Winston Churchill when he gave evidence before the Peel Commission of Inquiry into the future of Palestine in 1937. The British government appointed the Peel Commission of Inquiry in the context of the Arab revolt in Palestine of 1936 to 1939. And Churchill gave evidence, and in his testimony, he compared the Palestinians to a dog in the manger.
Oh.
A dog in a manger. And for your listeners who don't understand the meaning of the word, a manger is where horses live and they eat hay, and a dog doesn't eat hay, so out of sheer bloody-mindedness, the dog stops the horse from eating the hay. And Churchill also said that the Palestinians have no right to this land, and that why don't they make way for a race that's the Jewish race, which is superior, which is more worldly wise than they. The racist sentiments in this testimony are shocking, but not surprising, because racism and imperialism always go hand in hand together.
Amazing. I mean, even Winston Churchill continued in the same tradition. Now, I wonder if David Lloyd George was the principal figure in the making of the Balfour Declaration. Why is it called after Balfour?
Because Balfour was the Secretary of State.
But apparently he wasn't the main player, was he?
He wasn't the main player. He was a rather weak, woolly, laid-back British aristocrat. He wasn't a very effective politician, whereas Lloyd George was a very forceful and dominant personality, and he was very much the driving force behind the Balfour Declaration. But the letter to Lord Balfour, which incorporated the decision of the cabinet, was written and signed by Arthur Balfour.
And he bears the sin today, until today.
Yes.
Okay, if you don't mind, we'll take a brief break, and then we'll resume the discussion. نرجو أن تتابعونا بعد الفاصل. أهلا وسهلا بكم في هذه الحلقة من حوار خاص مع الأستاذ الدكتور آفي شليم، أستاذ العلاقات الدولية في جامعة أكسفورد. Professor Avi Shleim, when we talk about the Balfour Declaration, historically it was a stage in a series, because it was preceded by other British attempts to change the world according to their own desire. And therefore this would be the contexts in which the Balfour Declaration was born.
The context to the Balfour Declaration was that Britain was engaged in a world war and therefore needed allies. And in her search for allies, she made all sorts of promises. And there were three promises which related to Palestine, three famous promises that were incompatible with one another. The first promise was to Hussein the Sharif of Mecca, and the promise was that if he mounted an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, Britain, at the end of the war, would support the establishment of an independent Arab kingdom under his rule.
That was in 1915.
This was in 1915, and the promise was made in a correspondence between Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner in Egypt, and Hussein the Sharif of Mecca. The correspondence was conducted in Arabic. It was deliberately ambiguous on the part of the British, and later the British claimed that Palestine was not included in the promise.
Although Sharif Hussein seemed to be under the impression that it was included.
Sharif Hussein wasn't just under the impression. He's absolutely right in claiming that he was told by the British that Palestine was included because they promised him Greater Syria, and Palestine was the southern part of Syria. So he was in no doubt at all that he had been promised Palestine, and the British wanted to fudge the issue, but the British never kept their promise to him of an independent Arab kingdom. There was no independent Arab kingdom. So whether Palestine was included is to some extent an academic issue. This was in 1915. In 1916, Britain reached an agreement with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This was a secret agreement which divided the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire into spheres of influence. A French sphere of influence in Lebanon and Syria, and a British sphere of influence in Iraq. The two partners couldn't agree about Palestine, so the compromise was that there would be a condominium, that Palestine would be placed under a separate international administration.
Is there any evidence at that time that the British were contemplating a Jewish homeland, or not yet?
Not yet. But the Sykes-Picot Agreement flatly contradicted the promise to Hussein the Sharif of Mecca.
Indeed.
Because instead he was promised an independent Arab kingdom, and this agreement divided the Middle East into imperial spheres of influence. But it was a secret agreement which was only revealed, exposed after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917.
The Russians apparently were the ones who brought up the issue.
Yes.
Because before the revolution, they were party to it, weren't they?
Yes, they were. After the revolution, they exposed the imperial machinations of the Allies, and this was acutely embarrassing to both Britain and France. Now, worse was to follow, because in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, promising to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At that time, the Jews were 10% of the population. The Arabs were 90% of the population. Britain had no moral or legal right to promise Palestine to the Zionists. And the Jewish writer Arthur Koestler summed up the Balfour Declaration by saying, here was one people, Britain, promising the land of another people, the Palestinians, to a third people, the Jews.
Now here there is a bit of debate among historians regarding the role of the Zionists. How was important the role of the Zionists in bringing about the idea of the Balfour Declaration? I tend to sense in your writings that you side by the opinion that regards the initial role of the Zionists to be trivial, and that there was really no Zionist plot initially. It was the Zionists who were approached rather than them approaching the British about it.
The Balfour Declaration represented a huge, tremendous diplomatic breakthrough for the Zionists in Britain. And it was a personal achievement by Dr. Chaim Weizmann. And Dr. Weizmann was the key to what was to follow. He was a Russian Jew. He was a reader in chemistry at Manchester University. In Manchester, he met C.P. Scott, the editor of the Manchester Guardian, which later became The Guardian. Scott was very familiar with the British political elite. He fell under the spell of Dr. Weizmann, and he introduced him to the British elite, to Arthur Balfour and David Lloyd George. And during the war, the British government set up a laboratory in London, and Dr. Weizmann was a researcher in that lab, and he developed acetone out of using chestnuts to make acetone. The importance of this for the British war effort is that acetone cooled the machinery that produced shells, so it greatly speeded up the pace of producing shells. And David Lloyd George had been Minister of Munitions, so he was very impressed with Chaim Weizmann.
That's where the connection comes.
Yes, indeed. And later on, Lloyd George said about the Balfour Declaration that at the end of the war, he said to Dr. Weizmann, how can we thank you for your wartime services to the British Empire? And Weizmann replied, I don't want anything for myself, but I would like something for my people. And the result was the Balfour Declaration. Well, if you believe this, you will believe anything. A state is far too much as a reward, as a gift for someone who helped in a lab.
So you don't think that you think this is just an anecdote of something?
It's a way of Lloyd George avoiding the responsibility for what he had done, because he was responsible for the Balfour Declaration, which had terrible consequences for Britain as well as for the Palestinians. So he tried to wriggle out of his responsibility and to say it was an act of generosity, of rewarding the Zionists. So there was a strong Zionist lobby around Chaim Weizmann, and a lot of the members of the British political elite were very taken with him and very persuaded by his vision, and they preferred to listen to Chaim Weizmann rather than to the Jews, rather than to Sir Edwin Montagu. And Lloyd George, by aligning British policy with Zionism, acted in the belief that this would be beneficial to the British Empire. But it wasn't beneficial to the British Empire. From the point of view of British interests, the Balfour Declaration, as I wrote in my paper, was a colossal strategic blunder. because on the one hand, the Zionists weren't satisfied with what Britain had done for them. And the dialogue in the interwar period went as follows. The Zionists said to the British, "You promised us a state." The British replied, "We didn't promise you a state, we promised you a national home, which is not the same thing." So in the end, at the end of the mandate in 1948, the Zionists were completely disillusioned with the British, and they became enemies.
And they fought them.
Yes.
Now, before that stage, the Balfour Declaration would never have probably materialized had it not become part of the British mandate afterwards, right? Because it became an international instrument in that sense.
This is very important because after the war, the League of Nations gave Britain the mandate over Palestine, and Britain wrote the Balfour Declaration into the League of Nations mandate, so it became an international instrument. So what had been a fantasy became now a concrete reality, and Britain, as the mandatory power, was obliged to implement the Balfour Declaration. But no one asked Britain, it was a British idea to write the Balfour Declaration into the League of Nations mandate. But I would like to add to that the mandate, in general terms, asked Britain to prepare the country for independence. And this was a sacred trust to civilization, in the words of the mandate. So Britain had a responsibility not just to the Jews in Palestine, but to the entire population, to prepare them for independence. Now, the Arabs, the Palestinians, kept demanding represent national assemblies, a national executive, elections, which was only natural. And the British persistently refused to hold elections, refused to allow democracy. The cornerstone of British mandatory policy from the beginning of the mandate until 1948 was to prevent the emergence of representative institutions in Palestine until the Jews became a majority. So Britain...
Through migration.
Through migration. Because if there had been elections and a National Assembly, one thing it would have done is to limit Jewish immigration or any immigration to the country. That's why the British refused to have representative institutions until the Jews became a majority. So the Balfour Declaration was the original sin, but British mandatory policy continued along this one-sided, in this one-sided way of doing everything to support, to help, and to promote the Zionist movement, and to curb and limit the Palestinian majority in the country.
So despite Zionist criticism of Britain for not doing enough, throughout the mandate, the British were actually doing everything possible to serve the Zionist project.
Yes. The Balfour Declaration included two promises. One, to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, and the other was to protect the civil and religious rights of what was described curiously as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The 90% became the non-Jewish communities, which was a strange way of putting it. But in a retrospect, Britain overfulfilled its promise to the Zionists. It promised a national home, and it helped them to achieve a fully fledged independent state, and it never met its promise to protect the rights of the Palestinian majority.
Now, there has always been debate about whether national home meant a state or not. Now, I think recently there have been some commentary about on this issue with reference to some of the documents in the British archives that actually British senior politicians at the time didn't mean to promise a Jewish state. But I read in your paper that Balfour, and I think probably Lloyd George as well, admitted that what they meant by a national home was a state.
Balfour, Lloyd George, and Winston Churchill said privately at different times in the 1920s that by national home they meant a state. They admitted that. And remember that even a national home was quite an ambitious concept for the Zionists at the time. And therefore, they didn't ask for a Jewish state in Palestine because that would have immediately antagonized everybody.
But a national home would have been a stepping stone.
Yes, but it wasn't obvious that a national home would be a stepping stone to a state. So it was less threatening to the Palestinians to talk about a national home. The concept of national home didn't exist in international law. It was a fudge. It was an imprecise notion. And interestingly, the first draft of the Balfour, what became the Balfour Declaration, was submitted by Chaim Weizmann. He was asked for a draft.
He wrote it.
He wrote a draft. There were many, many drafts, and he wrote one, and he submitted it. And that talked about constituting Palestine as a Jewish commonwealth. This was ambitious because it referred to the whole of Palestine, reconstituting it as a Jewish commonwealth. And one member of the cabinet modified that. He changed it to support for a national home for the Jews in Palestine. This was again very ambitious, very ambiguous, because it wasn't clear whether the national home would be just for the Jews who lived in Palestine, or a national home for the entire Jewish community from everywhere in the world to come and have a national home in Palestine. So all these ambiguities dogged the Balfour Declaration all along. But the key thing is that the British policymakers, in their own minds, thought that the national home would be the beginning of what will eventually be a Jewish state.
Now, coming back to the future or to the present, with all these facts available for us to see in fine details, what explains the insistence of today's British establishment on considering the Balfour Declaration something so noble and something so good?
Well, let's look at the Conservative Party. It's overwhelmingly pro-Israeli. There is the Conservative Friends of Israel, and they include over 80% of all conservative backbenchers. They include all the members of the present cabinet, and the most ardently pro-Israeli member of the cabinet is Michael Gove, and it includes the Prime Minister Theresa May. As you said at the beginning, Theresa May said in her speech to the Conservative Friends of Israel that we are approaching the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration and we shall be marking it with pride. And in the same speech to the Conservative Friends of Israel, she described Israel as a beacon of liberty, a beacon of freedom and liberty and tolerance, a country in which all people, regardless of religion, ethnicity or gender, enjoy equal rights. So
she never watches the news.
she clearly doesn't watch the news, and if I had to give a title to her talk, I would call it Teresa in Wonderland. It's completely detached from the reality on the ground, and the reality on the ground is that for the last 50 years, Israel has been a colonial power. If you look at Israel in its pre-1967 borders, it's a democracy, a flawed democracy to be sure, but it's a democracy. There are political parties, there are elections, there is procedural democracy. But if you look at Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, it most definitely is not a democracy. It's an ethnocracy. It's an political system in which one ethnic group dominates and rules over the others. There is another word for describing the situation in Israel-Palestine, and that's apartheid. And Theresa May and her colleagues completely turn a blind eye to the reality of present-day Israel, to the oppression of the Palestinians, to the disenfranchising of the Palestinians, and to the ethnic cleansing that goes on all the time. So the Nakba isn't a one-off event that happened in 1948. It's an ongoing process. They also turn a blind eye to the war crimes that Israel has repeatedly committed in Gaza. So the position of the British government with regard to this conflict is completely untenable, and the British government has no reason to mark the Balfour Declaration with pride. On the contrary, the British government should hang its head in shame over the long history stretching back 100 years.
I just have a couple of minutes before we conclude, and I want to ask you about a remark I read in a presentation you made. You said that it is in the best interest of Israel for a two-state solution to be established. Do you still believe a two-state solution is possible after all what we've seen?
All my working life, I supported a two-state solution. And to this day, there is the broadest possible international consensus behind a two-state solution. But in the last few years, I've reassessed my position, and the conclusion I reach is that a two-state solution is no longer viable. It is no longer viable because of Israeli expansionism, because of the Israeli settlements on the West Bank. Today, there are nearly 750,000 Israeli settlers on the West Bank. So Israel clearly has no intention of allowing the emergence of an independent Palestinian state. Even if there was a two-state solution, there isn't enough land to make a viable Palestinian state. A Palestinian state, if it were to come about, would be a series of disconnected enclaves without territorial contiguity under Israeli military control. In short, Israel, by its systematic policies of building settlements on the West Bank, has rendered all but impossible a two-state solution. I therefore today support a one-state solution, a secular state with equal rights for all its citizens. I know that the Israelis would never agree to such a solution, but I, as a Jew, and as an Israeli, have no difficulty with the notion of a one-state solution. Indeed, I regard it as a noble vision, and it would be the best possible way forward after 100 years of Zionist encroachment on the rights of the Palestinians.
Well, Professor Avi Shleem, it's been a great honor to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. وشكرا لكم على حسن المتابعة، وإلى لقاء قادم في حوار خاص آخر.